My name is Karen Conti. I am a lawyer. I have been a lawyer for 37 years. I have a law office in Chicago. I've practiced all over the country. I'm licensed in California and Illinois. I've handled a variety of cases over the years. I've handled a Supreme Court appeal, and probably what I'm most known for is representing serial killer John Wayne Gacy in his final set of death row appeals in 1993 and 1994.
So tell me the story of how you became a lawyer.
Well, I always wanted to be a lawyer, and I know that I was very argumentative when I was young. In fact, one of the things I talk about in my new book is my father had reminded me that when I was about 7 or 8, there was a story on the news about the death penalty. And I told my dad I did think that was wrong for the state to kill people. And he said, no, I think, if you killed somebody, you should kill. And I reasoned with him that it's like if I didn't clean up my room, like you would come into my room and mess it up. Does that make any sense, Dad? So I think from that stage on, interestingly, the capital punishment was kind of one of the important issues to me. And then I just kind of always felt like, as the middle child, as middle child's children will, feel a little bit of the, unfairness of the older brother getting to do the stuff, the younger one getting babied, and I was the one who didn't get any of those advantages. So I think that combination, and maybe my desire also to run for public office at some point, which I don't have anymore, also motivated me to go to law school.
Okay, so skipping a little bit forward, tell me how you became John Wayne Gacy's final attorney or lawyer.
It was really a fluke. As I told you before, my law partner and I had handled a case before the United States Supreme Court a few years before in a First Amendment issue. Gacy had been sued by the prison. In our state, there's a law that says that if you are able to afford your incarceration costs, the prison can sue you for that. And so that's what they did to Gacy. And Gacy, knowing that he had a date with death in 7 months, was more concerned about his money being taken away, such as it was. So he wanted to have us go down to the prison and talk to him about these First Amendment issues. Frankly, I had no desire to represent a serial killer for free in a First Amendment case when he had capital punishment looming, but the curiosity got the best of me. And my law partner and I just couldn't pass up the opportunity to talk to the world's most prolific serial killer at the time and to go on death row, a place neither of us had ever been. So we were committed to doing nothing, and we made the trip 6.5 hours south of Chicago and went to see John Wayne Gacy.
And did you represent him like up until he was actually executed?
Yes, we agreed to represent him in some of these First Amendment issues. We got rid of those pretty quickly, but we said to him, the only reason that we'll do that is we want to be on your death penalty team. So we joined 2 other lawyers who were experts in the death penalty, and together we formed a team that represented him for 7 months until his execution on May 10th, 1994.
So when you first met him, what was your first impression of him?
My impression was that he was unassuming. He didn't look like an evil man. He didn't act like an evil man. He was short. He was portly. When you serve time in prison, you have what I call a prison pallor. He did not look like he was capable of doing what I know were some of the most evil acts I've ever heard of. He was engaging. He was glib. I wasn't afraid of him at all. And I suppose the only thing that frightened me, or I guess I should say chilled me, is that I figured if this guy acted so normal in my presence when he did all these things in his past, and I know he was capable of doing, who else might I know who I am talking to or dealing with or trusting who are capable of those things too? Because you cannot rectify those 2 parts of his personality. You just can't do it.
So how would you say John was like as an all-around person from your point of view, getting to know him for that short amount of time that you did?
I would say that Gacy was compartmentalized, meaning he lived a very normal life most of the time when he wasn't killing people. I know that sounds bizarre, but that's how he got away with it. So from what I know of him and from how I got to know him, he was a very disciplined man. He would get up early. He had his tasks. I know when he was on the outside, he worked very hard at his construction business. It was successful. He volunteered time in churches, and he was a church goer and a strict Catholic. He mowed the lawns of his neighbors and shoveled their snow. I mean, he was an all-around good guy. And then he would, at night, go into his car, troll for young men and boys, take them back to his place, torture them, sodomize them, and kill them and bury them under his house, most of them. So it was this divided life that he had. And if you just knew the first part of it, you wouldn't dislike him. I've had a lot of clients who I didn't get along with or maybe liked less than I liked Gacy. But you have to understand he's a sociopath, and sociopaths will say what they want you to know and what you want to hear in order to manipulate you. So knowing that, you understood that Gacy wasn't a real integrated person, and therefore he was kind of a shell of a human being.
Did he ever speak about his crimes, or did he still claim to be innocent up until the end?
He, at the time that he was arrested, he confessed to his first lawyer, and he confessed in great detail, from what I understand, including the names of many of them, where he took them from, where he buried them exactly in his crawl space. It was almost like a photographic memory. But thereafter, he said he didn't kill any of them and denied that he made the confession, which is untrue. He said the first one was self-defense, and the rest of them, he had no idea how they got under his house, which again was a huge lie. So no, he wouldn't talk about it. And I questioned him greatly about it. John, how did these young men and boys, how did they get buried there? And he just deflected and wouldn't answer. And that was common for him because he was in denial as to who he really was.
Speaking of who he really was, did he ever talk about Pogo or Patches or any of those characters that he created?
Yes, he was very proud of his clowning. And I talk about this in my book because I try to analyze it a little bit as to what was really going on in his head, why a person with these dark tendencies would want to dress up like a clown. And he was very proud of it. And just so your listeners know, he never abducted any children while he was dressed as a clown. That was not part of the whole process. He rather would volunteer at parades and go to children's hospitals. And sometimes he would just dress up as a clown and go to a bar and talk to people. It was very odd. And he was very specific with his makeup, and he wanted makeup a certain way. He described it to me. And I think if I were to speculate from a psychological standpoint, that he knew about his obvious dark side. And I think this was his way of sort of masking that. And he would talk about how he'd go to parades, and if a child was too eager to grab the candy, he would kind of pinch them until they cried. And then he would deny that he did it, which is really horrible. But that was what he did. And I also think that he liked to mask who he was. And I think, the whole concept of when people are at masquerade parties, they do things they wouldn't ordinarily do because their identity is masked, literally. Or why texters, can say anything they want, but in person they would never say it. That sort of de-individuation is the word for it. I think Gacy needed to do that to kind of separate himself from who he really was.
A lot of people, when it comes to John Wayne Gacy, a lot of people always ask me about his artwork, his Pogo the Clown, his Patches, sex skulls, so on and so forth. Did he ever talk to you about that, or did he ever get into depth about his artwork and selling it to different collectors and so on and so forth?
Yes, he was very proud of his artwork, and he gifted me 3 paintings while he was on death row. I will tell you, they are hideous. Just really hideous. And he would kind of, do the same painting over and over again. The pogo he's waving. There's a skull clown that he gave me. It's just a skull with a clown hat on it. And then he did a special one for me, which is a seascape, which also is very awful. And he did sell them. I don't think he made huge amounts of money, but whatever money he made, he used it in the commissary. And in prison world, you could protect yourself by giving money and giving cigarettes, or food to other inmates who didn't have any money in their commissary account. So that was his method of really protecting himself, because death row is a very, very dangerous place. And although Gacy was compartmentalized and was in control of his violence tendencies when he was there, some of the other inmates were not. And in fact, he was stabbed by one inmate. So I think that was his way of keeping himself flush to keep himself safe.
So I've heard rumors over the years that him and Andrew Cocorales were in a relationship on death row. Do you know if there's any truth to that?
Interesting. What kind of relationship did you hear?
Like a sexual relationship, and he was also
Wow.
painting the those bird paintings for him?
That would surprise me. I met Andrew when I was there. He was another despicable criminal. He was into cannibalism, and he would eat women's body parts with, I think, his brother and maybe another person. He was a really bad dude. Uh, I don't think Gacy painted for him, because I think his paintings, Andrew's paintings, were a little bit better than Gacy's. I never heard that rumor about them having a homosexual relationship, but I probably wouldn't. Probably wouldn't have told me that.
Funny enough, the person who told me was Robin Gecht. He was one of the Chicago Rippers as well. I did an interview with him in the past, and he said they were butt buddies when they were on death row together.
Ah, that is so interesting. I guess that wouldn't surprise me. Um, and one of the Rippers actually was released from prison, isn't that correct? And was living in the western suburbs
Yeah,
of Chicago.
Tommy, that's Andrew's brother. Yeah.
Yeah, which I always say, if you're going to take a spring break trip, don't go to that city.
Right, right.
How he got out is blows my mind.
Just wild that he was released.
You know, it's really interesting because being on death row in Illinois at the time was not what you think. You know, you always think of this plexiglass, you're behind the, and you're completely safe. Actually, you're released into this bullpen with all of these killers, and some of them are killed their whole family or poisoned people or eaten body parts. And you're sitting there as a lawyer, in Chicago, you kind of know who these people are, because there's not a whole lot of death penalty stuff going on, but you recognize these. Oh, there's the I-57 killer. Here's Ronaldo Hudson, who killed, some carpenter in his house. I mean, you're looking around and you're seeing these criminals who, unlike Gacy, who was measured, and he was a planned, organized serial killer. Some of these people were psychotic and unmedicated, bad combination. And add a third one to that, nothing left to lose because they're on death row. The only reason that you felt at all safe was because they knew that as lawyers, we were there to save Gacy's life. And if we could save Gacy, then maybe their lives could be spared too. So they had something to gain. And so to some extent, you felt a little relief, but certainly it wasn't, you really weren't safe there.
Did you at any point in time think that you would be successful saving his life, or did you think he was just a lost cause at that point?
I initially thought maybe we could make an argument that someone would listen to. And the reason I thought that is because we hadn't used the death penalty a lot during the 1970s and 80s. There was a moratorium in the country on the death penalty when the US Supreme Court found it unconstitutional because the jury instructions were not sound. And so it took a while for the states to then redraft their jury instructions to prosecute people, and for those appeals to finally get to an execution. So during my lifetime in my state, there weren't executions. So I kind of was in disbelief that Illinois was really going to execute anybody, but if it was going to be somebody, it was going to be Gacy. But when I got into it, I realized that all of our arguments were being made on deaf ears. Why? What judge who's elected would ever overturn anything in this case? We weren't trying to overturn the verdict, of course. Gacy was in prison for life. There was no question about that. We were just trying to void the death penalty sentence, but nobody was listening to, even though we had some good arguments actually that were compelling and could have been compelling for other defendants. For Gacy, no one was listening.
So why do you think people are so fascinated with people like John Wayne Gacy, Jeffrey Dahmer, Ted Bundy, serial killer culture?
It's astounding because just when you think there was the definitive docudrama or docuseries, there's another one, right? And it just keeps on going. But I've actually looked at this, and our passion for crime and true crime and even fictionalized crime, goes back to, Jack the Ripper. People wanted to know who Jack the Ripper was. There were speculations back in the 1800s. I mean, even Sherlock Holmes, we wanted to solve the crime. And there's also psychology studies that say that particularly women like to watch this kind of true crime because they want to protect themselves, and that by watching it, they feel that now I can have an understanding of who these bad people are, and therefore this isn't going to happen to me, which I don't know if that is actually true or not, because I think these people are really experts at hiding who they really are, even for someone who's onto them. But again, I think this whole podcast generation of solving crimes, people love that. I mean, this whole Gilgo Beach murder case to me is very much like Gacy. He has got a lot of parallels, and I think we just can't get enough of it. And I also think one other thing is that we as a people are fascinated by the outliers in society. We love the people who are the best of the best. We love the Michael Jordans and the Olympic athletes who are breaking records and are as good as you can ever be at anything. And then we love the opposite, the people who are deplorable, the people who do things that you can't even think up, let alone imagine that they're doing. And so I think that extreme obsession with those two polarized kind of things makes sense to me.
Right, like living vicariously, but not actually living that life.
Well, and I think that a lot of people will tell you that they have dark feelings that they don't act on, and that this appeals to them. Now, interestingly, I don't have any of those dark feelings at all, so I don't relate to that. But I've heard people say that, this kind of thing is compelling to them because of their own little dark things. And what's interesting, and this may be a tie-in, the psychiatrist, psychologist will tell you this, when there's an execution in a given city, the crime rate, in particular, the murder rate, goes up. And, I'm not saying that executions cause people to commit murder, but I think it's sort of like subliminal advertising. I'm hungry, so I see a ad for candy bars, and so now I want to go get a candy bar. And when people are murderous or suicidal or violent in their head, and they see death, and they see the lethal injection, and they see the videos of Gacy, the bodies coming out of the house and all that gore and death, I think that makes people maybe be a little bit more suicidal or murderous. But we'll never know, I suppose. You can't connect the cause and effect there, but certainly the statistics are there to show there is an increase in crime.
Hmm. That's a good way of putting it. Do you remember the day that John Wayne Gacy was executed? Do you remember what that was like?
I do. May 10th, 1994. I got about 3 hours sleep. We were working on some final appeals before the United States Supreme Court. We did some media interviews. We went to the prison where they had flown him up from the southern prison that he was in the southern Illinois. He was up near the Chicago suburbs at a prison called Stateville. So we drove there, and we had to make a visit with him to make sure that he was of sound mind, because if a person is psychotic or a person is off the rails, then we can get a stay of execution. So I had to make sure that Gacy knew what he was doing and what he was competent, and he was having none of it. He said, "I'm perfectly fine. I'm not insane. I never was." And he basically said, "You're going nowhere with that argument, Karen." So we did spend some time, and while we were there, we got the news that the U.S. Supreme Court had rejected his final appeal. And I was tasked with the job of breaking that news to him. So that was kind of interesting, because I was telling him that he was going to be executed. And that was hard. And even, when people ask me, was he your friend? He wasn't my friend, but he was a human being who I connected with. And he was my client. And he was on my watch, and I took that seriously. How could you not? Because what's hard to describe is this. It's easy to say, Brian, because I'm sure a lot of your listeners are like, I could do that myself. when you get to know somebody and there's a human being there, and they have friends and they have family and they have people who love them and they're not hurting anybody, it's just really hard to see this happening in right before your eyes. And it was difficult.
Did you like after he was executed, did you have any like I don't want to say I guess like any like type of emotions that ran through you?
Oh, yeah. Um, we came back later. We let him talk to his family and friends, and then we came back later to say our goodbyes. And he was having his last supper and all of that. And he was kind of in denial. I mean, he didn't act like this was the worst day of his life. I would have been throwing up in the corner somewhere, not talking to anybody, but he was the life of the party. And I think that his ability to be in denial helped him, because I don't think he was really facing what was ready to happen to him. Um, but when I saw all his family and friends saying goodbye to him and they were sobbing, these are people who loved him unconditionally, even though he did all those terrible things. And it was a strange feeling. It was a feeling of loss. It was a feeling of this is wrong. Like, I want to call the police because I know they're going to kill him at a certain time, but the authorities were the ones who are doing it. It's hard. And thereafter, I tell you, it was almost like a grief period, like not a grief period of losing a relative or something like that, but it was just a feeling of loss and a feeling of like, was there something I could have done? And I don't think there was anything more that any of us could have done, because the facts were the facts and the law was the law and the machine of executions was going strong. But you just have this feeling of regret and loss, and it followed me for quite a long time. In fact, I vowed never to take a death penalty case again. It's too much. It took too much of a toll on me.
So that was your last death penalty case that you okay.
One and done. I served my cause, and now the death penalty has been abolished in Illinois. So we don't have executions anymore.
Right. So did you two ever talk about anything like what his last meal would be, his last words, and what would happen to his body after the fact?
Well, his sister took care of all of that posthumous stuff. And we talked about it a little bit, and we drafted some papers to make sure that she had the right to take any of his property out of the prison. His sister is a very kind, nice, loving woman, and she just wanted to make sure that people weren't stealing his stuff and putting it, for sale and all of that. The sister did arrange to have his brain analyzed by a psychiatrist in Chicago to see if there was anything organic, because she said to herself, I was raised in the same family and I didn't go that way at all. She didn't think her brother was really subjected to abuse that was that extreme. And so she had that done, and the psychiatrist gave the opinion that there was nothing unusual about Gacy's brain.
Hmm.
But yeah, we had some of those conversations, because as being his death row lawyer, I thought that was part of my job to make sure he was prepared and that his wishes after his death were followed. And he had some specific requests I probably can't talk about, but he was very measured. I know that he had Kentucky Fried Chicken because he offered some to me at the very end, and it was very strange because he had managed Kentucky Fried Chicken franchises in Iowa before his crime spree in Chicago started. And that was where he first got arrested, because he tried to attack one of his employees at a Kentucky Fried Chicken. So it was a little creepy that he had that as his last supper. He had also had fried shrimp and Diet Coke, among other things.
That's quite the meal for your last meal. So you have a book that you recently published about your time representing Gacy. Can you tell me about that and where people can purchase it at?
Sure, I appreciate that. It's called Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy, Defending America's Most Evil Serial Killer on Death Row. And you can buy it on Amazon, Walmart, Books A Million, Barnes and Noble. And I will tell you, I waited a long time. I waited almost 27 years to start writing it. It will be the 30th anniversary of his execution coming up in May. And I waited because I kind of was done with the story. As I told you, it was difficult, and I knew the victims' families were tired of the story. I wanted to just lay it to rest. But during COVID, I started to think about it, and I was approached by a production company to do some docudrama. I didn't really want them to take my story that I hadn't written. So I thought, let me just write my truth and let's see where this goes. Whether I publish it or not, I don't really care. I'm going to do it. So I sat down and I found that it was a really great process because I not only was looking back at that Gacy experience with wisdom, more wisdom than I had back then. I was a very young lawyer, an experienced lawyer now. I'm a seasoned lawyer, 30 years have gone by. And I can kind of put things in perspective to kind of see how that really bad experience, that really adverse experience with all the backlash that I was subjected to, was actually very good for me. It was good for me personally. It was good for me professionally. And as a result of all of those Gacy things, I became a legal analyst on television. I've been doing that for over 30 years. I've had radio shows continuously for 30 years on a major Chicago market. I was made law professor to teach the death penalty. I take one case and now I'm an expert. So all of these things happened and they were positive after Gacy's execution. And so my book is about my conversations with him, about some of my speculations as to what made him the way he was, about what that experience was like. I do include some of the arguments against the death penalty. I try not to preach about that because I'm not going to change anyone's mind. But I also talk about how, as Gacy's only female attorney, I was treated a little differently, but I was able to use my gender to deal with him in a way that was different than the other male attorneys. And so the book, I would hope, I know this sounds strange, should be uplifting to people, even though it's a very gory topic and a negative result. It's about how you can grow from adverse experiences.
So this is more so less like your experiences with John and kind of like drawing out the like what the appeals in the book and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I talk about the appeals, but it's not like a legal book where you have to
Hmm.
sit there and I'm citing cases or I'm preaching to you about the death penalty. I mean, I have to include that because that's people ask me why did I take the case because I'm completely opposed to the death penalty. Always was, always will be, even for Gacy. So I do make those arguments, but it's really the story. And this sounds strange, but there's some humor to it as well. I mean, I was raised in a household. My father was a professional stand-up comic, so I used the humor. Gacy was a very humorous man. We used humor together to get my job done, which I had to do. I had to be professional and get my job done. So there's some lighter moments in the book, and then there's some heavy moments in the book. But again, I think that your readers, when you finish it, and I've been told this from people who have read it, that they find it riveting, but also uplifting, strangely.
Hmm. Well, we breezed through all my questions. I appreciate you taking the time today to come on here and talk about Gacy and your book, and I look forward to reading it. I'm actually gonna order it today and read it as soon as I can.
I appreciate that, and I hope everyone enjoys it. I really appreciate it. Killing Time with John Wayne Gacy.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and take care of yourself.
All right, you too.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.